settling comfortably. Tonight we follow stone paths and shorelines through a small land that has carried many names in many tongues, hills that keep the scent of time, a lake that remembers every breeze, a desert that teaches the pace of hoof and step, and harbors that lift their lamps toward returning boats. Nothing urgent waits for us. If sleep arrives, the story will keep its quiet road and welcome you wherever you rejoin it. We will stay near ordinary, steady things, a clay lamp glowing in a window cut from limestone, a well in a courtyard, where a rope knows the bucket's weight, olives turning under a beam, a loom at a doorway, parchment smoothed by a careful knife, a balance at market that wakes fair each morning, a harbour bell that speaks in soft weather. When tradition speaks, I will say tradition remembers. When records are firm, I will say records suggest, and then we move on unhurried, low-voiced, clear. Our gentle thread will return, again and again, to a single threshold lamp, the kind that makes edges kind and to simple measures. A straight line laid with cord, a jar filled to the right mark, a road counted in cairns, a week counted by rest. We will drift from terraces and vineyards to synagogues, churches, and courtyards, from caravan gates to scriptoria, and gardens from winter rain to summer dust. No arguments here, only competence and care. How people turned light, water, paper, and bread into a life that sleeps well and wakes ready. The first part. Night settles over limestone like cool water poured from a clean jar. In the hill country, house lamps appear one by one, in narrow windows, ovals of warm light that make edges kind, a lintel smoothed by many hands, a threshold that remembers every foot. A breeze comes off the ridge with the smell of time and crushed fig leaf. Far below, a wadi keeps its stony grammar dry most days, silver sometimes, always ready to be a road for both water and people. On a roof made flat for sleeping and work, a family's jars are sunk in sand to the shoulder, so the night can teach them coolness again. A woman turns a lid just enough to hear a good promise in the seal soft, intact, and sets it back. Beside the stairhead, a small cistern mouth is covered with a stone cap and a folded bit of linen under the lip, so the cap will not learn to bite the rim. Someone thought of that years ago. The habit kept the idea. Down a lane that remembers sandals, a well in a courtyard keeps its calm. The rope knows the bucket's weight and does not squeak because someone rubbed a little oil into the pulley at dusk. A boy lowers the bucket and listens for the moment water turns from echo into touch. He raises it hand over hand. No one hurries him, the rope will not thank a rush. A cat watches the wet mark grow dark on the rim and decides to approve. Stone keeps house here. Terrace walls hold soil where hills would rather shrug it off. In the dim before dawn, two neighbors meet at a corner where three fields greet each other. They set a cord between pegs until it sings straight, not tight, and smile at the agreement. This line belongs to all three, each will inherit a fair curve. They tap the capstones with the backs of their hammers and listen for the sound that says a winter rain will not find a complaint here. The first light draws fig leaves into detail and shows the steps cut into slope, short treads, honest risers, a path a goat would respect. A woman ties her cloak at the shoulder and carries a basket up to the olive beam, where a press waits with the patience of wood that knows its work. She lifts the beam with a stone counterweight and lays a mat of fruit beneath. The olives have been bruised by a hand, no hurry in the bruising, and now they give themselves to pressure that feels like a long exhale. Oil darkens the channels cut in the stone bed and walks toward a waiting jar. The jar's mouth is covered with cloth that has learned to breathe and filter at the same time. At a low wall, a neighbor crushed sesame on a quern that remembers circles. He adds a little salt and a sip of oil and makes a paste that will teach flatbread to speak longer at table. A girl watches the smoothness arrive and helps with the last turn, both palms on the upper stone. The sound is the same sound as rain on fig leaves, soft, steady, promising. Tradition remembers vineyards on the slopes and stone towers where a watcher kept count of birds and days. Records suggest the terraces themselves are the main art, walls set to a fair line, drains tucked into corners under flat stones, steps placed where a foot expects them, soil-edged so it will not wander when water asks it to. A man tests a little chute with a jar. The trickle finds its path and forgets to quarrel. He pats the lip of the chute with 2 fingers, the way one thanks a door for not arguing. By mid-morning the roof wakes to cloth and thread. A loom is set near the parapet where breeze visits like a well-behaved guest. The warp runs true, because the beam is honest. The weft passes with a shuttle that never scalds the fingers. A woman rubs finished linen with a smooth pebble until it agrees to lie flat, and then holds it to the light air, but answerable. She ties a dyed thread at one end, so the family will know which edge to trust when they cut. In the doorway, a boy sharpens a knife on a wetted stone and keeps his strokes small edges, like to be taught, not bullied. In the cool of a side room, parchment learns patience. A scribe stretches a scraped sheet on a simple frame and strokes it with a knife, whose voice is barely a whisper. He tests a reed pen on a shard. The line begins, travels, and stops without fray. He mixes lamp black with gum and a breath of water from a jar that sweats kindness through its baked walls. He writes a small fragment, no proclamation, just to list the household and the village share, oil to the lamp at the gate, barley to the oath jar in the court, bread for the road keepers on the ridge, 1 measure to the widow whose stare is hard. He reads it once for meaning and once for memory. The room agrees. The market waits where 2 lanes discover they are a street. Scales sleep under cloth until the steward of measures arrives with a chest wrapped in linen. He lays out the weight, stone and bronze, their edges softened by honest use, and wakes the beam into fairness. Vendors greet the weights like old friends and smile at the feeling, which is not surprise. A woman buys figs counted by feel, olives weighed by beam, salt by pinch. The steward does not lecture, the chest itself is the sermon. Midday folds the town into shade. Bread calls on reed mats, and a baker taps to loaves hollow, strong, ready to travel. He sets a heel aside for the watchman who will pass at the 2nd hour of the afternoon. In a corner, a pot of lentils learns what it means to be finished, and a hand with a wooden spoon shows garlic how to behave. The house chooses one sound to keep the slow drip in the jar stand and lets the rest lie down. Beyond the lane, a small synagogue keeps its simple square, a bench along each wall, a niche for a lamp, a chest for the scrolls that breathe in a wrapped bundle. Doors are open to the court, where a fig gives more shade than fruit. A reader runs his finger under a line and repeats it softly, once 4 cents, and once because words like to be heard twice when they carry weight. The children learn letters on shards in the dust, a line, a hook, a door, a house, a hand, a water. The teacher smiles when their mouths remember before their fingers do. Rain here arrives by season and by promise. In the months that the sky remembers the sea, clouds walk in from the west with a mind to be generous. Roof spouts trained by the builders pour into jars and cisterns that have learned to be clean. A man checks the plaster inside a little tank. No cracks, no bubbles, only a smooth bowl that will not betray the winter to summer. He lays a palm on it and admires the work of someone he will never meet. That is a good kind of pride. On the lake, a boat with a low, kind sail slides along the reed beds. The helmsman keeps a finger on the tiller, where thousands of fingers have made a groove that fits all hands. He reads the color of the water and the behavior of small waves where the bottom rises. He follows pairs, a cove aligned with a distant notch, a line of trees against a chalk face, a standing stone, and a pale house wall keep that bracket, and the boat will love you. He brings the bow to the ring at the quay in one long thought and ties a loop that any neighbor could untie and retie in the dark. Rope is a language that says stay, wait, soon, and now is good. The harbor's bell has a low, fair voice. It speaks only for weather and return, never alarm. A keeper wipes it with a cloth and hangs it where soft wind can find it. He keeps a ledger that lists nothing romantic and everything that lets sleep keep its place. Nets mended, ring repaired, oil filtered, 4 lamps on the far jetty, water jars filled, a lost or found at the reeds and returned to the bench with a knot so it will not wander again. He draws a lamp in the margin and writes one word beside it, edges. Tradition remembers gates called by kings' names and roads sworn by prophets. Records suggest most steps fell into the low music of staying ready. Terraces repaired after rain. Stones walked back to their lines. Jars rotated so last year's bottom becomes this year's top. Sabbath brought in with 2 lamps, lit and bread hidden a little from temptation. A woman sets to small wicks in oil and breathes a line to the quiet work ends rest begins the week has counted itself faithfully. The house answers by lowering its shoulders. Afternoon glows pale on chalk hill and olive leaf. Shepherds bring animals by alleys as old as gardens. A girl closes a small gate with a peg that knew the hole before she was born. She pats the gate and grins at the obedience. In the press court, a jar catches the last thread of oil, and a stopper carved of fig wood finds its seal with a twist that feels like a promise kept. The press beam lowers, asleep without complaint. A neighbor brushes chaff from a mat and carries a handful to the dovecote pigeons. Write small loops in the sky that mean everything is as it should be. As evening leans into roofs and lanes, lamps learn their circles. One burns in a limestone window, one in the market niche over the waits chest, one by the synagogue's chest, one at the harbour shed where rope lies in good loops, one near the well where a folded cloth waits 4 hands. Each circle softens corners that would have been harsh without help. Each says to the room it touches, "You will not stumble, you are expected, you belong." Our night archivist, who likes to visit every place that keeps order, writes on a small piece of fibre by lamplight. Terraces fair cistern sound press working waits honest harbour polite rope retort lamps trimmed. He draws a lamp in the corner and, for this land, adds a tiny mark beside it that stands for rest after 6 and kindness at gates. He folds the strip once, not twice, no need to teach it a habit. It won't keep and tucks it under a smooth stone. If you want one sleep-sized picture to carry, a terrace wall with a little drain under a flat stone, a cistern mouth with a linen kindness under the cap, an olive beam lowering itself into peace illumined by a parapet choosing to be. Air, a shop beam waking fair when the wait remembers its partner, a boat meeting its ring with a loop any neighbour can open to lamps at a table where bread is covered for a while. This is how a small land keeps its nights. In the blue hour, hills draw near to each other. The lake keeps a single line of light like a quiet promise. Somewhere, a bell with a fair voice tells the harbour that weather has chosen to be gentle somewhere else. A reader closes a scroll and lays his hand on the chest. Roofs breathe on a stair that taught itself to be kind. Feet find their knowledge in the dark. The lamp in the limestone window keeps its oval, and the edge of the world forgives itself for being made of stone. The second part. Morning comes from the sea in a slow, even sheet. Along the coast, salt pans wake first, shallow rectangles edged with cut stone, their surfaces still as thinking. A keeper walks the narrow berms barefoot, not to be picturesque, but because skin tells truth about firmness. He tests a plug with 2 fingers. Brine moves from one pan to the next with the calm of someone taught good manners. The sun will do its work without being asked twice. He leaves a ladle laid across the pegs, so wind will not carry it away. Tools like to know where they belong. Beyond the pans, a low harbour folds into a curve that has always fit a boat's ambitions. Rings along the quay shine where rope has polished them 4 years. A skiff returns with nets that glisten like wet writing. Fish are lifted one by one into a shallow basin and rinsed into water sea first. Well next, so salt keeps what it should and does not teach bitterness. In a shaded yard, women rub coarse salt into clean fillets and lay them on reed mats. There is no hurry, only sequence, wash, salt, turn, rest. The day will decide the moment when firmness becomes travel. Along the outer wall of the town, a clay conduit keeps its own quiet song. Far to the north, an aqueduct steps across gullies and drapes itself along the contour as if stone were a careful animal. Arches hold nothing but air and yet carry water as if it were thought. A keeper walks at the pace of shadow, listening where tile meets tile. When a joint asks for kindness, he lays lime and sand with the flat of his hand and waits for the little glisten to dull. Water rewards patience by saying yes to distance. At the edge of the market quarter, a glass shed wakes. Sand, plant ash, and crushed old shards wait in baskets. A worker feeds the furnace with a measured arm until the part's mouth glows and forgets its former color. A blower gathers a small, obedient drop on the end of a pipe and turns while breathing as if the sea had come indoors and decided to behave. He rolls the bubble on a wet pad that sighs without complaint. A child watches the shape arrive jar, cup, little lamp body and understands without words why pouring and breathing are cousins. Sea wind brings other trades with the same patience. In a dye yard a line of vats sits under a lattice that tempers light. Cloth goes into color in that slow rhythm dyes prefer. Soak, lift, breathe, return. The keeper writes a tiny mark on a scrap, 1 loop for a short dip, 2 4 longer and pins it to a cord near the vat. He will not forget, but he prefers not to ask memory to carry everything. On a bench nearby, a rope maker turns flax into line with a twist learned from grandparents. He sets the coil in shade, so the lay will dry honest. Roads leave the harbour in 3 miles, along the beach toward towns that catch the same wind inland, toward terraced hills and south to where stone opens, and the land measures you quietly. A milestone stands where the beach path turns to firmer ground, its top worn to the shape of hands that found the same comfort in the same place for a long time. A courier pauses and touches it, as a sailor touches a ring at the key. Touch keeps promises from dissolving into talk. He adjusts his strap, checks the knot at his satchel, and walks until the last sound from the harbour bell becomes an idea rather than a note. By mid-morning, a caravan gate in the town's low wall chooses its shade. The Combion Square, with a cistern at its heart, keeps its rooms around a courtyard, like letters around a word that means rest. A woman draws water with a rope that never squeaks and pours it over a jar sunk in sand to its shoulder, so travellers will find coolness that did not require a hero. A keeper has scratched a faint ring on the cistern's lip where strangers' cups should stop courtesy, not law. In the corner, a shelf holds jars sealed for any who arrive after the gate closes. Lids are tied with easy knots that open in the dark. On the hard ground west of the hills, olive presses wait through the hot hours. A beam is lifted with a stone and asks nothing but sequence and time. Basketed fruit blushes, then gives way to weight with relief. The old stones that catch oil hold channels cut to humble slopes. Each thread finds its jar without being told more than once. A stopper wears the exact taper a particular mouth prefers. The pair's been together 4 years. On a lintel, someone has kept the habit of setting 2 small lamps at dusk on the evening before rest, one for the work finished, one for the work forgiven. The market finds its temperature by the measure of shade. Stalls open when cloth covers sit just right and close when they admit they have done their duty. A steward of measures arrives with a chest wrapped in linen, lifts the lid as if beginning a familiar song, and lays weights on the beam until fairness wakes. Scales like to be remembered before they are needed. Their honesty is more willing than. A fishmonger presses a thumb to a fillet and nods. A baker taps a loaf. A salt keeper breaks a cake along the fault line he planned yesterday with a damp thread. A boy counts coins into a cloth purse and ties it with a loop that can be trusted by sleepy fingers later. Tradition remembers sailors who knew when to leave and when to stay, and roads with names that promised empires. Records suggest that most days the sea and the road answer to quieter marks, bells that spoke in soft weather, rings that shone with polish, not pride milestones touched, and not tallied condors left on a latch that everyone understood. Aqueduct joints that learned to not call attention to themselves. Dates for rest that arrived by habit and were greeted with lamps instead of speeches. In a court near the harbour, parchment lives where air moves, but dust does not choose the same room. A scribe trims a quill and writes what the sea and road asked to be remembered. Oil to lamps along the quay, rope repaired, and returns salt for fish yard. Water jars for gator weight tested and found fair. A bell wiped and hung. He draws a lamp in the margin. He writes the days, one adjective, enough. He speaks the lines once aloud for the shelves, which prefer a voice to a thought when the hour is long. Beyond the market, gardens keep their square bargains with light. Figs lean over leaf basins that ask for a ladle at morning and evening. Herbs hold the smell of winter, even when winter is far. A low wall, the height of a knee and no more, makes a place out of dust. A small gate, pegged rather than latched, makes entering a choice rather than a conquest. A girl carries a jar with both hands and discovers that balance is more secure than strength. She tips water onto a bed and grins when it travels the line she drew with a stick an hour ago. Afternoon slackens the surf. Nets stretch like maps on poles, weights dangle like punctuation that has decided to rest. A pilot sits on the low stone where the aqueduct steps into town and checks a line he has drawn on a board. Palm roof rock, then roof-free flight. He will steer by pairs at dusk because pairs are generous to tired eyes. He paints a tiny lamp in the corner of the board and sets it under a stone so it will not try to be a sail in the night. Near the con, a room smells of leather that has decided to be useful. A cobbler rubs oil into a strap and presses the whole cutter through with a hand that knows exactly how much to ask and no more. He hands back a sandal with a new thong tied in a knot that will open at first try even in whirring. The customer steps, tests, and smiles at the feeling of not having to think about feet. A good road lives at ankle height. Evening comes the way it prefers, one window at a time, each oval of light making its small promises. The salt pans turn to mirrors, the aqueduct line darkens and becomes a resting thought. The con's courtyard lamp learns its circle and finds faces. At market, the chest of weights closes with the privacy it deserves. At the fish yard, the last tray is covered with cloth that remembers breath. At the quay, a bell talks to wind. At the synagogue door, two small flames say, "The weak will now step to the side and let rest stand in the middle." Our night archivist walks the harbour lane, writes on a strip by the lamp. Salt moving water sound, rope retort waits on escate Skirtius road paired rest kept. He tucks the strip into a shallow box on a shelf above the ring where the good loop sleeps. He likes to leave the day where the day will find itself tomorrow. If you want a single, sleep-sized picture, shallow pans holding sky, a ring polished by years of simple arrivals, a bell that speaks in weather and refuses to shout, an aqueduct step teaching water to cross air, a consistent lip with a faint ring, scratched for strangers' cups, a milestone smoothed by hands, a pilot's little board with pairs, and a lamp drawn in the corner. The sea keeps breathing, the road keeps counting, lamps keep edges kind, sleep can borrow their habits. The third part. Stone gathers people the way a harbour gathers boats. In the high city, streets run like quiet water between walls that remember hands. Gates open in the morning with a low courtesy, lintels except upon hinges answer with a soft yes because someone rubbed them at dusk. Above the market, roofs make a small sea of flat light where jars rest in sand and linen dries with the patience of walls. A stair cut into bedrock keeps the measure of feet. The treads are short and even no one has to look down to trust them. Midway, a stone trough catches roof water from a spout trained to be helpful. A boy tips his cup along the trough's lip and learns that stone can teach a line to be honest. He wipes the lip with his sleeve without being asked. Clean edges remember kindness. Under a quiet floor, the city keeps its private cool. Cisterns shaped like pears with narrow necks and deep bellies, plastered smooth to the point where palm and lime become one idea. A keeper lowers a lamp and watches the circle glide over white walls. He sees the thin red mark last winter's check and smiles when today's water rests just shy of it. He tests the mouth with a funnel woven of palm and linen dust that would have joined the house, decides to stay a stranger. He places the cap onto chips of stone, so the rim will never learn a bad habit. Streets take turns with shade. At each bend a drain hides its mouth under a flat stone, where sweepers guide the day's dust and last night's leaves with palm ribs into a small, polite fall. A mason checks a joint where two paving stones meet. He lays a seam of lime with a finger and sands it with a breath of grit until the line turns from sharp to useful. He pats the seam with the back of a trowel and says nothing out loud. The street thanks him by taking weight without complaint. In a yard where light sits like warm milk, a potter burnishes a jar with a smooth pebble. He leans the jar against his knee and turns it with a rhythm familiar to cats. A glaze more memory than shine goes on in thin breaths, not layers. Across the lane, A plasterer floats a wall with lime and water until the surface begins to hold a faint sky. He tests it with a bone tool that never lies. The wall decides to be a room. Nearby, a mosaic worker places a row of tesserae in sand and lime river greens, stone creams, a line of blue, or one will notice except by how calm the floor feels. He presses each square with a thumb until it remembers to sit with others. In a long, cool room that cares 4 letters, parchment waits on shells that leave a finger's width of air around each roll. A scribe smooths a sheet with a knife not much louder than breath. He mixes soot ink for everyday names and an iron gall for the lines that must last, never in a hurry, never in clots. A quill's point meets a shard for its first test. Begin, travel, stop, satisfied. He writes a page that will stand between neighbors when memory disagrees, measures for market day, when scales must be woken in public roster for wall watch, when lanterns must overlap list of jars turn this week, so dryness will be shared. He draws a lamp in the margin and a tiny ring beside it. Lamps and rings keep towns from becoming opinions. At the northern gate a chest of standard weights sits under cloth. The steward arrives with a key that enjoys being remembered. He lays out stones and bronze, pairing each with its partner, until the beam admits it has no preference between left and right. Vendors greet fairness with the lightest of grins. They like when the day begins by agreeing on truth. A woman buys salt and counts out coins by touch, then hands one back after a breath, because the beam, not the fingers, has the last word. Trust makes sleep possible, tonight and next week. In a stonemason's shed tucked into the wall's shadow, Ashla learns to be social. Faces are dressed with a square that knows when to stop. A mason kisses a high spot with a chisel, listens, and stops before stone turns stubborn. He strokes a leveling shim of cedar and lays it where two cousins disagree by the thickness of a barley husk. The wall, relieved, takes weight as if it were a kind of water. Outside, a child runs a hand along the new joint, surprised that stone can be that quiet. A tannery lies downwind, beyond a bend where the air turns. Hides soak in lime, then drink fresh water on a smooth sloped floor. A worker scrapes with a bladeless tool and talks with his partner about rain signs and prices of sesame. Nothing urgent, all useful. Vats are covered with woven lids to teach smell about courtesy. A boy oils a strap and learns when leather asks to be left alone. He ties the strap with a knot that opens easily because trouble and darkness should not be asked to negotiate with tightness. The market's call, shade cloths slung from wall irons that learn to accept loads without bending. Bread arrives with a hollow sound and a warm cloud. Olives shine without boasting. Figs rest on reed trays that do not teach dampness. A salt grey fish, salted yesterday, lies with quiet ambition beside a jar of lemon slices that waited in brine for just this introduction. A dyer lifts cloth from a vat, lets air answer colour, then returns it for one more soft breath. A glassman sets a new lamp on his board. Someone will carry it home pressed to the chest, so flame will learn its circle as quickly as possible. At a small school near the eastern wall, a reader draws letters on a wax tablet with a bone stylus. A child whispers as he copies house, door, hand, water, and the whisper travels into the room's wood and stays there as a kind of varnish. The reader moves to numbers, small ones, measures a house needs, days until rest, coins for oil, loaves for the watchman. He names the week's middle day and the day with 2 lamps. Children nod, rhythm makes memory polite. Toward afternoon, roof lanes wake. Women lift jars from sand beds' cool shoulders, grateful mouths, and carry them to the stairhead cistern. A man filters lamp oil through a porous cup. He is not religious about it, he is exact. A carpenter checks a parapet's coping stones. Where wind likes to begin mischief, he taps them back toward patience. A boy mends a rope loop for a roof pulley and tests it with a brick. The loop lowers the brick without drama. It gives the brick back. This is the loop's entire religion. The city counts itself in circles rather than walls. At corners, lamps are hung with the same knot, so hands can learn in the dark without blasphemy against sleep. In alleys, hooks wear the gentle polish of baskets and cloaks. In courtyards, A clay lip around a tree's bed keeps water where roots expect it. On steps near a cistern, a faint scratch shows where cups should stop wider than a law, narrower than desire. Tradition remembers names for gates, towers, and courts. Records suggest the city survives by smaller names: lamp, seam, vent, loop, mark, shelf, peg, peg again. A legerdman in the watchroom, the evening's shortlist spell tested. Weight chest closed, wall patrol paired, cistern caps set with chips, oven dampers shut and drawers. As always, a lamp. Then he copies the list and sets the copy on a nail where the night can see it. Lists left where hands already go are the kind that earn their keep. Evening folds along the ridge. A breeze passes through the market like agreeable advice. The weights return to their chest. The gate lintels get a last touch. The cistern mouths sleep under their caps. A reader in the cool room ties a ribbon around a roll and lets his fingertips rest there a heartbeat longer than needed. A mason wipes the chisel's face with oiled cloth. A child places a pebble on the ledge by the school door for no reason he can explain. The pebble will become a custom. Lamps learn their circles at the speed of breath. A parlor lamp softens a table where bread hides under cloth. For a moment of gratitude, a corner lamp turns a hook into a friend. A stair lamp writes ovals along a wall so toes will not forget the next step. At the northern gate a lamp finds the beam finds level, the steward nods. The city decides that the day has been sufficient and makes no speeches about it. If you want one picture to keep for sleep, a stair that does not ask for eyes, a cistern pair under stone, with a calm red mark, a seam rubbed from sharp to useful, a shelf of rolls breathing with space around each, a chest of weights. Waking a beam into fairness, a lamp that makes a hook kinda loop that turns gravity into courtesy. The high city answers to these more than two trumpets and sleeps because of them. The fourth part. The desert begins not with sand, but with quiet stone that learns to hold heat and give it back slowly. Air that finds fewer leaves to talk to. Light that prefers broad statements. On the eastern slope beyond the high city, paths turn pale and then patient. Cairns stand at distances that make sense to feet. Between them, a dry streamed body keeps the shape of rain, so that when the winter sky remembers the sea, water will know exactly how to pass without arguments. Where the rock relaxes, an oasis writes a green letter. Palms make their own shade, and the space under them becomes a room with a roof that moves. Water rises through stone and is invited along shallow channels edged with pebbles. A keeper opens a clay gate with 2 fingers and lets the trickle walk to a date bed. He does not pour. He suggests. The bed answers by darkening evenly. On the bank, a mat waits 4 dates to dry into a sweetness that travels well and forgives rough roads. Balsam grows here, where heat tells its long story kindly. A woman nicks the bark with a blade that remembers tenderness, drops gather, at first shy, then confident, into a glassy tear that she coaxes onto a shard. The resin smells like memory held in a jar. She sets the shard under a light cloth. The sun finished the sentence. Later a small amount will join oil 4 lamps in a temple recess, making the flame behave with unusual patience. Lamps respect good oil. Along the slope above the springs, terraces accept the work of stone and time. Dry laid walls hold the gradient just enough to keep soil from remembering gravity. A mason checks a face with a plumb of cord and stone and listens to the weight stop trembling. He tucks a flat shard into a seam that asks for a translator between 2 stubborn cousins. The wall relaxes the way a shoulder does when a strap finds its rightful length. A narrow stair with honest risers invites the next row of palms to meet the day. In a shadowed room near the water, cords are twisted from date fiber. A rope maker dampens the strands, walks backward, and sings the counting song that keeps the lay from wandering. He sets finished coils in shade, so they will dry with good manners and remember them later on a ring or a beam. A child touches the rope and knows at once that it is not just a thing, but a rule stay. Wait, released aught to fiber by hands and time. Under an awning of woven palm, a press that once knew olives now listens to grapes. Basketed clusters, dusty with bloom, are laid on a grooved bed. Bare feet step, steady and slow, and purple answers gravity. Channels cut with a modest slope bring juice to a waiting jar with a cloth throat. There is a second press beside the first, a beam and weight, for when patients wants help. A woman sets a stopper turned of fig wood on the rim and rehearses the twist that will seal with grace later. The day contains the instruction already. Tradition remembers desert paths leading to caves with jars where words rested. Records suggest that cool air and steady darkness are good servants to parchment and reed. In a low chamber, a man rubs a sheet with pumice and smooths it with a knife, whose voice is hardly louder than breath. He writes with ink made of soot and gum, not for kings, but for the neighbors who share rules about water, rest, and waits, and the quiet kindness that keeps visitors from thirst. He draws a lamp in the margin. This is becoming a habit across towns and seasons, and caps the ink before it thinks about evaporating. He ties the roll with a simple loop that opens without fight. Words sleep better when knots are kind. Cisterns here are not grand. They are small pairs in the rock, plastered clean, covered with a stone that wears a folded bit of linen under its lip, so the rim will not be taught a bad habit. A keeper lowers a cup on a cord, hears the change from echo to touch, and brings water up without splash. He skims a leaf and lays it aside as if offering it a soft hour. A child watches the level and marks it with the edge of a shard. The mark will fade and return with the year. This pleases the child. On the plateau, a small monastery chooses a quiet edge. Its walls match the color of stone where lizards sun themselves. Doors open inward to rooms with good intentions. A kitchen with a clay mouth that bakes bread and does not shout. A store where jars sit shoulder deep in sand. A room with a table, a knife, and lamps that prefer trimmed wicks to speeches. In the scriptorium, a reader copies a line that has helped tired people for a long time. Set your scales in the morning, where everyone can see. Close your gates at dusk with a knot someone else could open. The stranger drink. Before you ask his news, he pauses, breathes, and lets the letters dry as if they had chosen to be a moment. At the edge of the compound, a small garden rehearses the geography of rest. Beds edged with stone, channels that can be opened or closed with a thumb, herbs that remember winter in their smell, lentils that agree to become soup without taking more fire than a patient cook enjoys tending. A novice carries a jar in both hands and learns, as many have, that balance is stronger than strength. He tips a trickle along a narrow sill of clay and watches it walk, as if the ground had planned to receive just that much and no more. He smiles, not at himself, but at the idea that the world can be taught to be gentle, and often agrees. Where the desert rolls away into farther thought, a way station keeps three kinds of shade: cloth over poles for the hour of heat, stone over air for the hour of wind, palms over both for the hour of gratitude. A keeper makes a sign at the well, a faint ring scratched where a stranger's cup should stop. He does this every spring and will do it again every spring. Some work earns its dignity by repeating. A caravan arrives with the grammar we know, roping good coils, jars with lids tied like travel hats, bells that count without hurry. A trader sets a little tray of resin, dates, and salt under the shade, because bargaining likes to be near small sweetness and small truth. A runner from the coast wipes dust from his face with a damp cloth and counts the time by how quickly the cloth cools his skin. Enough, he says, and sits with his back to a wall that will keep watching him without being thanked. On a ledge above the springs, a watch hut sees both water and road. A watcher keeps a board with pairs, a notch and a pon, a dark ridge and a pale slab, a cairn and a bend in the wadi. At night he lifts a string with two knots and aligns them with a star and the edge of a far hill. He writes a small note on a shard wine from the west, lamp steady, a jar replaced at the second cairn, and sets the shard where morning hands go first. He feels the country's breath in the call that rises from the trees and decides that sleep will be simple tonight. Past noon, a date yard wakes to its softest industry. Women open fruit with a reed and lay it on mats. Children sprinkle sesame into a bowl that smells like a patient celebration. A man turns a press that crushed the last sweetness from rejected fruit into syrup for winter jars. He tests a drop on his nail and waits for the right slow slide. He nods and writes a mark on a strip. 2 jars for the con, 1 for the watch, 1 for the well-keeper's shelf. He draws a lamp next to the word well, without meaning to. Lamps are becoming our punctuation. In the quiet between hills, a tannery that serves the caravan listens to water. Hides soak, then rinse on a smooth slope. A worker scrapes with a tool that offends no surface. Lids cover vats to persuade smell to be polite. Straps are cut and oiled and left in shade, so they will remember to be generous at the buckle. A knot is tied, tested, and retied the same way until the hands know they can trust themselves in the dark. This is not ceremony. It is mercy to the future. Toward evening, wind brings a cheek of sea in its breath. Palm fronds talk about weather in a language that does not raise anyone's heart. Lamps learn their circles. At the scriptorium desk, at the well niche on the garden wall, at the con gate, where late arrivals will read generosity in light, and in the jar left for them in the watch hut, where a board with pairs and a string with 2 knots sit ready to continue their quiet friendship with stars. A bell with a voice low enough not to disturb goat speaks once. The hour accepts its shape. Our night archivist, who has been following this country by its humble instruments, writes on a strip by lamplight. Terrace steady, rope-taut, dates kept, resin collected, cistern sound, well-marked, jars left, pairs remembered, lamps trimmed. He folds the strip once and tucks it under a smooth stone at the clay gate that lets water walk. A lizard runs over the stone, becomes a thought, and is gone. If you want one picture to carry toward rest, a clay gate opened with 2 fingers, a balsam tear answering the sun undercloth, a rope coil cooling in shade, purple juice walking a modest channel to a jar with a cloth throat, a small pair of a cistern under stone, rim kind with linen, a shelf of jars touched by sand to the shoulder, a string with 2 knots learning a star, a scratched ring, or a well lip where strangers' cups agree to stop. In the oasis, edges are taught to be gentle and they agree. Night settles like a palm leaf lowered to make thought dimmer and breathing slower. The watch hut counts the lamps, 1 at the scriptorium, 1 at the well, 1 at the gate, and decides the country is awake in the right way to let sleep do its work. The desert keeps its larger silence. The springs keep their smaller song. Between them, people live by measures that forgive and remember. This is enough. The 5th part. Valleys learn to be generous, where hills decide to open their hands. Down on the plain, a river slides through reeds and stones with the patience of someone who has learned to share a path. Fords sit where gravel holds its shape. A low bridge near the market keeps its feet in water and its back to the sun. At dawn, a mill wakes on the bank, a wheel with paddles, like kind hands. Water presses each in turn. The axle learns to turn without speeches. Inside, the millstone remembers circles and grain remembers what it can become. A miller lifts a scoop of barley with emotion that has no pride. He feeds the hopper as if telling a story he has told well before. Flour falls into a chest lined with linen and smells like a promise between neighbors. He pinches the grind and knots, fine enough for a flatbread that travels, coarse enough for a pot that seeks strength. A boy wipes the stone with a fig leaf to quiet dust. Leaves make better cloth when stone is involved. The wheel keeps its slow argument with the river and loses kindly, which is the point. Upstream, a shallow ford studs the water with stones, set just proud of the flow. A keeper tests each stone with a staff, and the boot he turns 1 a finger's worth, and the path wakes. He lays a branch of willow in the water above a slippery place, so feet will learn it with their eyes. A woman carrying a jar pauses, watches the light on the ripple, and chooses a step that will greet later feet kindly. Behind her, a man leads a donkey with panniers tied with knots that open before they argue. Even animals appreciate a language that says wait, now, and soon. The bridge near the market is not grand. It is 3 low arches of dressed stone. Each arch a question, the river answers with yes. A mason runs his hand along the cutwater that tells debris. Split yourselves and behave. He wipes a seam with lime and sand until it goes from sharp to useful. He steps back and lets water test the thought. Satisfaction does not need applause. Fields here sleep under winter rain and wake to summer wind. Along irrigation ditches, little gates of clay, and would open with the persuasion of 2 fingers. A girl in sandals and a shawl carries a dipping bowl and teaches a trickle to visit the onions and then the beans, then to rest in a shallow basin near a fig. She lifts a palm to taste the air salt when the west wind comes, dusty when it turns, and sets a jar near the bed so a slow line of cool will collect around it by evening. A man shapes a low ridge with a hoe whose handle has the polish of 3 generations. He makes curbs that water likes to keep straight lines, of 4 stone walls and the words that need them. On the edges of fields, threshing floors wake to long circles. Oxen walk without hurry. Children learn to scatter straw just before hooves arrive, and to rake aside afterward, so kernels can confess themselves to baskets. Winnowers face the afternoon breeze and lift trays until chaff becomes the sky for a brief visit, and then stops wanting to be grain. A steward notes the measures with a stick on a tally board and rubs out yesterday's counts with a thumb. The new day should not be asked to carry old numbers. Where the road meets the market gate, a cord high above the lane ties one wall to another. It is not to trip anyone, it is to teach the neighborhood how to be one room when rest arrives. A keeper ties it with a knot that opens easily in the morning. Below, stalls remember their morning motions, cloth lifted, pole set just so, shade found, scales woken. The steward of measures opens the chest and pairs stones until the beam stops caring which dish is which. Fairness is not a miracle here, just a habit. In a baker's yard, a claymouth breathes even heat. Loaves go in low on appeal, but as learned humility, they come out shining with oils that learn to be air in the oven's patience. A woman pricks a few with a reed, so steam will not show pride later. She sets to her side under a cloth for evening lamps. A boy cuts a notch, or a small wooden token today's bread for the watch at the ford, and slides it on a string that keeps such promises in order. Under an awning, a weaver sorts dyed threads by dusk rather than by name. See wine, grass, clay, lamp. She passes the shuttle through the warp and listens to the cloth answer. A neighbor brings skeins stored with bay leaves to keep at peace the moths that think too much of themselves. The weaver smiles and places a bay on the loom's beam to thank the idea before the cloth earns it. At the bridge, a smith adjusts a ring set in stone where boats favor a halt. He rubs tallow into the bolt, not to flatter iron, but to spare rope. He tests the ring with a tug that admits both kindness and strength. Nearby, a rope maker measures a coil with his forearm and lays it in shade coils dry honest where shade thinks. A fisherman checks the will of his net's knots, 1 or 2 complain. He retires them in the knot the old keeper uses at the quay, the one that opens for neighbors even in the dark. Past the mills, a low row of workshops keeps useful heat. A potter pulls a jar through air like a thought being clarified. He smooths the shoulder where hands prefer to hold and scrapes a faint ring there so fingers will find home by habit. A tanner works downwind, lids politely on vats, straps rinse long, oil rubbed in with a patience even leather appreciates. A saddler tests a buckle tongue in its hole and smiles at the sound of ready. Toward midday, a traveller arrives from the ridge with a satchel of messages. He pours water into the jar sunk in sand to its shoulder, sits on the low wall, and opens the satchel's mouth. Strips tied with dyed wool remember who should read them. Colors match houses as much as names. He lays the strips on a board and puts a small stone at each corner to teach the breeze manners. A scribe at the market table receipts for oil, salt, and lamp wicks. He draws a lamp in the margin, then a ring, and does not apologize for habits that serve. Rest day approaches the way evening approaches roofs. Women sweep thresholds outward with reed brooms that know where dust wants to go. Jars are turned so tomorrow's hands will find cool shoulders. Wicks are trimmed, a pair of lamps waits with wicks just kissing oil. A cord above the lane makes the neighborhood one gentle room. The boy with the wooden tokens hangs the string on a peg and lays 2 tokens under a smooth stone for the keeper of the ford and for the steward of measures. It pleases him to give thanks with wood. Tradition remembers caravans and decrees. Records suggest weeks are kept by smaller instruments. A cord across a lane, a ring that will not argue with a loop, a mill that listens to water, a ford that watches its stones, a bridge that says yes without conversation, a chest of weights that wakes before coin does, a lamp that makes the edges behave before bread is broken. People sleep better when the week knows its own boundaries. The night archivist walks the river path with a strip and a reed. He writes, "Mill steady ford set bridge, sound, ditches obedient thresh clean cord tied weights honest lamp trimmed rest driving." He draws a lamp in the corner and, beside it, a small circle for the millstone and a small square for the bridge. He folds the strip and tucks it under a smooth pebble at the bridge's cutwater. The pebble looks pleased to be trusted. If you want a sleep-sized picture, paddles of a wool taking turns with water flour falling like fine rain into linen, a staff testing a forged stone, a claygate saying now to onions, and soon to be chaff learning to be sky in a afternoon and forgetting by evening, a cord tying a lane into one room, a ring rubbed bright by years of polite loops, the lamps waiting under a cloth beside bread. The valley answers to these kinder tools and keeps the country ready for morning. As blue hour slides down from the ridge, the mill quiets to a hum. The ford becomes a line of small moons where feet will step tomorrow. The bridge agrees to carry the night's light across without dropping any. To flames rise in a window, the weak steps aside and lets rest stand in the center. The river keeps its steady grammar. The town borrows it for sleep. The sixth part. Wool begins as weather on an animal's back, on a slope where stones keep warm secrets. Sheep move like a slow cloud, nibbling time until the flock smells faintly of kitchens. At first light, a shepherd ties a cord between two pegs and hangs shears from it, so edges will be honest and hands unhurried. He lifts a fleece with the care one uses to wake a sleeping child. The wool leaves the sheep in a single thought. The animal shakes, blinks, and forgives. A boy gathers the fleece into a low basket lined with woven reeds. The basket remembers spring every year. Downwind, in a yard that learned to serve the town quietly, tubs sit under a lattice that softens sun. A woman teases burrs from wool with two calm fingers and a comb whose teeth are patient. She lowers a bundle into warm water that smells of ash and olive soap. Grease answers water slowly and then agrees. The cloud becomes a river of fibers. She lifts the wool onto a reed mat and presses with open palms until drip becomes rest. She lays it where a breeze can think about it. The day will finish the rinse without speeches. Spinning begins with a stick and a disc, and the way hands persuade twist to walk. A spinner pinches a few fibers, turns the whirl, and lets stored breath become thread. The spindle drops and rises as if learning a dance it can perform while listening to the house. A child tries and laughs when the spindle chooses the floor. A second try convinces it to marry gravity on better terms. A basket of wools sits nearby, each with a shape favored by a different hand, some wide and slow, some small and quick. Thread grows in a lazy spiral on the shaft, soft as dust and twice as tidy. Carders sit with bowed frames strung with wire teeth that sing a low song. Wool passes between them like weather learning to settle into season. Locks surrender their secrets, align, and accept the spindle's rule without resentment. A woman sets aside a nest of carded wool, the size of a small loaf. She will spin it during the hour when the bread rests and the lamp learns its circle for evening. Flax keeps a different grammar. In a shaded corner, dry stalks lie tied in sheaves. A man breaks them with a wooden brake and reads the sound, sharp when to dry, low and happy when right. He scutches with a blade that does not cut so much as persuade. Fibers fall in long hair that a comb then arranges into ribbons. When he spins, he weights his fingers. Linen prefers a little water the way clay does. The thread that grows holds coolness the way stone holds night. Dye comes in patience, not in trumpets. A yard keeps vats like quiet moons. Madder that remembers root and earth. World that remembers meadow low wind. Woad or indigo that remembers skies. A keeper warms a vat until it thinks rather than boils. He lowers skeins with a stick, lifts them to the air so colour can find its nerve, then returns them to consider again. He writes a loop or two, or a small shard, how many breaths between dips and tucks it under a stone near the vat. Cloth will hold a memory better than a boast. Looms live where air moves, but dust minds its manners. On a ground loom under an awning, a weaver stretches warp threads and weights them with smooth stones wrapped in cloth. She uses a shuttle that has learned not to scold fingers. Over the path repeats, and cloth grows like an afternoon. Occasionally, she slides a coloured weft to draw a kind line across the field. Thin as a whisper, she rubs finished linen with a burnishing pebble until it forgets if there was ever stalks. Wool takes a different beat, the warp weighted, the weft cushioned, the fabric deciding to be a blanket that keeps a roof's night at a distance without feeling proud. Fuller's work where water can move away with decency. A step pool, its sides plastered, and its floor sloped toward a hidden mouth host's cloth and service. Workers press and lift with bare feet in a slow rhythm that keeps talk friendly. So brute lather whispers oil that kept the wool kind to hands, now leaves with thanks. Cloth contracts into strength. When it has learned firmness without stubbornness, they rinse until the pool feels like a thought completing itself. On a bench in the shade, a tailor measures for a tunic with a cord, not a ruler shoulder to wrist, neck to knee, the curve of a side that keeps generosity without making a sale. He cuts with a knife that only speaks in answers. Seams lie open, then turn inward, learning to hide their earlier selves. A bone needle drinks a little oil and thanks the hand by passing silk smooth through cloth. Hemming is a kindness to edges, it keeps trust from fraying late. Leather enters gently. A cobbler sets a last on the bench and persuades a strap to marry a soul without arguments. He punches holes that do not shout, he ties a knot a child can open in the dark with cold fingers. Sandal thongs learn the path between toes and along the arch where feet like a reminder rather than a command. He presses the thong ends flat and rubs them with oil so they will remember to be courteous to skin. In a narrow court, cedar and bay leaves sit among folded winter things. Moths dislike good company and so come less often. A woman lifts a folded cloak, counts the months in her head, and shakes dust with a frugal grace. She finds a seam that wants a second chance and gives it one. Mending is where cloth remembers. It belongs to people who belong to each other. A scribe in a cool room and a line for the market board. Standard weights were woken at the second hour. Dyer's vat will rest tomorrow. The fuller's pool is clean lambs, sheared without injury. The north slope thread for the harbour nets will be ready on the 7th day. He draws a lamp in the margin and a tiny spindle below it. Lamps and spindles were cousins, both turn small movements into long lines. At the market, a steward opens the chest of measures, the beam wakes fair. A woman buys skeins by count and weight, then lays a coin back because the beam asked her to, and she has learned to enjoy listening. A dyer ties a knot at the end of a newly coloured thread and whispers a name to it, not a secret, just a promise to match it later. A weaver trades a scarf for a basket of figs and 2 small bells for her sheep, the bells speaking kindness rather than command. Evening slides along walls with the coolness of stone remembering night. Lamps learn their circles by shorn fleece and skeins, by loom and folded cloth, by the bench where a needle sleeps point down in a small wooden apple, to flames rise in a window because the week has counted itself well and now chooses to rest. The cord across the lane settles into its knot that opens kindly in the morning. Sheep fold in pens that smell of time. The town agrees, enough. Our night archivist notes on a strip. Fleece glean, flax comb, spindle true, that patient loom set, fulling finished, seams turned, sandals courteous, lamp trimmed. He draws a lamp and a little well, tucks the strip under a smooth stone where the spindle basket rests, and decides that sleep can borrow the twist and the light equally. If you want one picture to carry toward rest, shears hung from a cord, between 2 pegs a reed mat holding rinsed wool, a spindle rising and falling like a breathing chest, a vat the colour of deep leaf or root warp stones wrapped in cloth to keep them from bruising the threads, a stepped pool where cloth learns firmness, a bow needle sleeping point down a last, with a sandal deciding to be honest to lamps, by folded cloth and a cedar leaves. The room becomes kind by such tools. Night finishes the yard with a soft hand. The spindle basket sits like a quiet planet. The loom keeps its figure. The dye vats breathe fragrant heat into the air that is already cooler than the day. A sheep flicks an ear and dreams of grass that forgives. A lamp keeps the oval where a seam learned to lie flat. The weak story drops its voice and chooses to end on a word that is short and good enough. The seventh part. Kitchens keep a country's quiet grammar. Before the sun chooses sides of walls, a courtyard stirs with the low music of clay and water. A jar sunk in sand to its shoulder calls without asking for praise. A woman waits a reed broom and draws dust toward the gate, so feet will find smoothness where the day begins. A boy lays kindling in a clay mouth that knows how to hold heat and give it back without boasting. Fire learns its circle pots, remember their places. Bread starts small, a pinch of yesterday's leaven waked with warm water, a handful of flour sifted through fingers that have learned to be a sieve. Dough accepts salt, a thread of oil, and a rest under a cloth that remembers breath. A stone quern turns impatient circles, the upper hand guiding, the lower stone agreeing. The sound is soft weather. When the dough is willing, a palm flattens it into rounds no thicker than a good promise. They go to the hot wall on appeal that never hurries. The kitchen's air shifts as bread says yes. Oil is a second light in the room. Olives bruised without anger gave themselves yesterday to a beam today. The oil settles in jars, bright and calm. A funnel of palm and linen teaches clarity. A woman tastes with the tip of a spoon, then with bread, and smiles at the way bitterness chooses to be helpful when kept small. She decants the day's portion into a lamp's belly and into a shallow bowl where herbs will meet heat. At the cool edge of the yard, a press for cheese keeps its weight ready. Milk warmed until it forgot the chill of morning listens to rennet, then succumbs to the idea of firmness. Curd ladled into a linen bag learns to be patient under a smooth stone. Quay runs away to a jar that will not mind being thin. The stone's weight is not pride, it is the kind of decision kitchens make, so that afternoons will be fair to workers' hands. Herbs are the country's low music. Thyme and savory dry in small bundles. Under an awning mint stands with its feet in a pot that remembers last winter's. Sun coriander seeds wait in a jar with a slate lid. A mortar learns the smell of toasted cumin. A hand lifts, circles, lowers, until the air explains itself. Garlic meets salt on a board and becomes polite. A thin line of honey persuades sour things to behave. Lemon in brine remembers the sea and forgives it. The cook names nothing aloud. The room knows. Vessels sleep in niches along a plastered wall. Jars for water and grain. A shallow pan for eggs and oil. A blackened pot that keeps the memory of lentils as a virtue rather than a stain. A pitcher with a lip that pours without scolding. A cup with a rim your mouth trusts. A wooden spoon rubbed with oil until it forgave steam. A cloth hung where hands will find it with their eyes closed. Everything is where tomorrow expects it. In the shade of a fig, a table throws a square of cool on the ground. A boy carries a basin and a jar to a low stand. He pours water and sets a folded cloth. Hands will be washed not because anyone is watching, but because sleep tonight will like the feeling. A girl counts places, a plate for bread, a small bowl for salt, another for olives, a dish for cheese, a dish for herbs bruised in oil, a cup for each, and one extra for the person who knocks. She places the knife with the handle toward the space left open. Hospitality like small rehearsals. At the market, the steward of measures lifts the chest lid for the morning's simple votes. Weights take their places until the beam loses its preferences. Figs are counted by touch dates. By strings in 10 salt is broken along yesterday's damp thread into agreed pieces. A woman brings a jar for vinegar and tests the lip with her finger. She nods and buys by volume rather than by weight. Choice is a courtesy when vessels are honest. A man stacks flat loaves in a basket freshly mended. The new stitch keeps edges from learning to wander. The baker gives him one more round for the roadkeeper, and writes that fact on a strip with a line that looks like a smile. A fishmonger wipes a clean board with brine and a reed. He lays salt fish beside a bowl of oil and lemon that will teach it to be generous. He pats the flesh with 2 fingers. Firmness answers like a gate that was hung square. A potter passes with a new shallow dish, its lip is low and kind. The monger buys it with a coin and a slice of bread. He prefers to pay where his wares will rest. Objects like to begin their lives with purpose. Back at the courtyard, shade has learned its afternoon shape. Bread rests under a cloth. Oil catches a leaf's reflection and keeps it. A small brazier wakes, a pan meets flame with a sound like a whispered agreement. Eggs go in 1 by 1 edges. Set herbs speak, a spoon persuades heat to be even. Cheese, released from its stone, learns about olive oil in a pan and decides to be friendly at the edges without falling apart. The cook tears bread with the habit of someone who believes in fair haves. A plate is set aside for the watch at the lane cord. In a side room that stays cool, jars hold pickled things that teach winter how to wait. Cucumbers pretending to be Jewel's turnips that chose to be bright lemons, learning patience among bay and pepper. A hand tests a string around a jar's neck and loosens it a hair, so the knot will remember kindness. On a shelf above, 2 clay cones of salt are wrapped in cloth. On the cones someone has pressed a modest seal, we know rush and to dots. It does not matter who made them. The house admires good work more than names. Evening lays a golden ribbon across the wall. A basin sits on the low stand, water waits, a folded cloth says welcome. A neighbor comes with a small dish of dates and sesame, soft truth and small sweetness. The gatekeeper's plate goes out through the door and a word returns with it. Whether choosing to be kind, the rope over the lane taught a better not, the watch done at the 2nd hour. A child announces that the lamp is ready. The lamp, trimmed earlier and given good oil, becomes its oval. Tradition remembers feasts with music that made beams feel flattered. Records suggest most evenings were a short song of gratitude and the work of not making speeches. To lamps at rest day's edge, bread torn in quiet hands, plates that agree to be shared, the extra cup used as often as not, the basin emptied with a sound that pleases cats, knives set down with the blade turned toward the table, never the room. It is possible for a people to practice good news with their wrists. Our night archivist sits by the threshold and writes on a strip, bread rise and oil clear, cheese set herbs, bruised salt, fair jar on his basin, ready lamb trimmed, guest expected. He draws a lamp and, beside it, a small bowl with a line of oil and herbs. He tucks the strip under a smooth stone, the hand-washing stand. Tomorrow we'll find it and feel seen. If you want one picture for sleep, dough resting under a cloth that remembers breath, a spoon lifting herbs through oil, a shallow dish teaching eggs to be calm, a cheese bag releasing slow. Kind drops a basin, unfolded cloth at the low stand, a pitcher lip, your mouth trusts a plate set aside for the watch. To lamps waking like small moons over bread, an empty place laid on purpose. Edges made kind, hunger turned into fellowship, thirst answered with a hand that knows a jar's weight. The lamp keeps its oval, the night accepts its portion. The 8th part. Water keeps its own quiet calendar, morning for hands, midday for work, evening for rest. In the hill city's lower quarter, steps descend to a pool that learned fairness from stone. The stair treads or even the sides are plastered smooth, the floor slopes toward a small, hidden mouth. A keeper lifts the flat lid over the inlet and listens for the soft change from echo to touch. He tests the flow with a reed gate open enough to renew, not enough to scold. Clean water prefers courtesy. Laundry wakes at first light, when shade still remembers night. Women kneel on a sloped ledge and teach cloth to be honest without shouting. Ashlie and soap-root lather speak in small bubbles, a board with a gentle rib helps, but never bruises. A rhythm finds the yard. Soak, press, rise, rinse, then the wringing done by 2 pairs of hands that know when to stop before seams complain. Lines stretch between pegs rubbed smooth by years. Cloth goes up like sails in a harbour of air. Wind, that old worker, takes its post. In a side court, a bathhouse breeds even heat. Water warmed in clay-bellied jars waits in a bench of niches. Cool water rests in a stone trough that never sweats. A brazier under a dome persuades air to behave. A man pours 2 bowls into a shallow basin, tests the mix with the back of his hand, and smiles at the fairness. A boy scrubs a smooth stone with sand until the surface remembers to be kind to skin. He leaves the sand in a small jar with a folded cloth tools that wait where hands expect them. Perfumers keep a softer fire. In a narrow workshop, oil and plant learn each other by patience. A copper pan sits in a clay nest, a low flame keeps it thinking, not boiling. Petals steep like letters that were never meant to be read loudly. A worker lifts the cloth, presses it without greed, and returns a blush of scent to a glazed jar. Another heats resin until it forgets to be brittle, then lets it marry oil until both become better behaved. He pours a finger's worth into lamp jars. Good oil makes small flames disciplined and writes a dot on a shard to remember this batch from that. The apothecary keeps shells like a small garden set upright. Dried mint, thyme, fennel, and bay sit in jars with slate lids. Salt rests under cloth. Honey remembers flowers without pride. A pestle turns seeds to a thoughtful powder. Vinegar introduces itself to bruised garlic, so both will travel better. On the door lintel, a scrap lists modest promises. Water for fevered foreheads, a rinse that keeps wounds civilized, a poultice that persuades stiffness to soften. He draws a lamp in the margin, then a small cup. Light and measure work together. Under the street, water learns to walk in the dark. A tunnel cut through limestone at shoulder height brings spring water from stubborn rock to a city that has learned not to ask the sky for daily exceptions. Pick marks on the walls still show the hands that taught stone to act like a channel. At each turn, a low alcove holds a lamp niche. Soot has blackened the curve where flame once leaned. A keeper steps carefully, checks a weep, and pats a thin seam with lime until it changes from sharp to useful. He listens to the small talk of drops. When they sound friendly, he lets the tunnel rest. At a courtyard drain, a grate of cedar slats lies over a small fall. Sweeps guide rinse water toward it. The way teachers guide letters toward words. The grate does not complain, it has a notch that remembers the sweep's wrist. A child places a pebble as a marker where not to set the tub and learns that pebbles can be laws if they stand in the right place long enough. The mother smiles and leaves the pebble to practice government. So fruit grows on the slope beyond the olive yard. Women dig a little, thank the earth with water, and bring the pale roots back with roots of weed tucked aside for goats. They slice the root thin and dry it on a reed mat, crumbled into water. It makes a lather without vanity. The yard smells clean, the way stone does after rain. Cloth rewards this kind of work by keeping quiet far longer between wash days. Quiet is the currency of sleep. A dyer visits with a whirring in his handcloth that lost its nerve in the vat. The bath keeper nods, sets a basin with tepid water and a pinch of salt, and lets cloth remember itself. He turns it gently, squeezes without drama, and lays it flat on a plastered bench that behaves like an honest table. The dyer leaves a skein of madder-colored thread as thanks. The bath keeper loops it on a peg where he keeps such friendly debts. Pegs that remember kindness become part of the town's memory. By the pool stairs, a small shelf holds sandals with straps loosened but not dropped. Leather likes to be invited, not ordered. A jug with a lip that never scolds waits beside a basin for hands before and after. A reed mat lies where feet meet floor, so the first step will be a promise instead of a surprise. These are not decorations. They are the difference between order and accidents. In the upper room of the bathhouse, steam writes itself on lime in a faint bloom that dries without staining. A man scrapes his skin with a strigil of bronze curve smooth. Edge polite hand rinses the story of the day into a jar set just for that. Waste goes where it should, clean goes where it belongs. A servant empties the jar into a soak pit the garden keeps under a fig. Roots do the rest, and the fig answers in sweetness at the right time of year. Circles, finished without speeches. A scribe arrives with ink on his fingers and asks for a bowl of warm water and a scrap of lint. The bath keeper brings both and says nothing. The scribe cleans the pen's stubborn mouth, oils the hinge of its tiny knife, and dries everything with a cloth that will not shed. Tools that touch words like to be bathed. 2. He leaves a line on a shard for the bathboard. Water refreshed, heat honest, great clean tunnel listening, so fruit saved. He draws, as ever, a lamp in the margin. Lamps are turning into punctuation for all the places where edges are made kind. Outside, laundry lines show their flags, nothing grand, just daily truces. Linen that will be a bed tonight, wool that will be a cloak tomorrow, a cloth that will sit under bread. A girl plucks a peg and listens to the note it makes in her fingers. She puts the peg back and chooses another peg that doesn't think it is a song. The right tool for the right work. That, too, is a kind of peace. Evening brings back the city's soft map of ovals. Lamps gather at the bath's door, at the pool steps, in the apothecary's niche, over the tunnel's outer mouth, beside the laundry yard. Hands are washed without an audience. Towels hang where tomorrow expects them. A jug is turned so its cool side will greet morning. A perfumer caps his jar and sets it in a bowl of sand that remembers desert nights. Sand is a good keeper of promises. The night archivist, who measures the country by its courtesies, writes on a strip: pool renewed, laundry quiet, bath fair, perfume patient, apothecary ready, tunnel sound, drains civil, so fruit saved, lamp stripped. He tucks the strip under a smooth stone on the bath's shelf where sandals wait. The stone knows him now and seems to approve. If you want one picture to carry toward rest, a reed gate opening the pool's inlet by a finger's width, cloth rising from water, with a sound like rain, remembered a lamp, niche soot soft above a tunnel, bend a copper pan steeping. Petals into polite oil, a cedar grate guiding water, where it should go, a bronze strigil curved like a kind thought, a peg that remembers not to be a song, a jar in sand, finding the discipline of coolness. Water, like light, prefers houses that teach edges to behave. Night draws the lines of the quarter softer. Steam dissolves lime, dries laundry, takes on the smell of air, sandals. Remember feet, without resenting them. Lamps keep their ovals the way the river keeps its slow counsel. The city sleeps clean not because it chased dirt, but because it invited order. This is enough. The 9th part. Where houses wake before streets. Along the inside of the gate, long rooms breathe cool air, made by thick walls and small, high windows. The floor is beaten earth with a temper that forgives drop things. Jars stand shoulder to shoulder on low rings of stone, so their bellies will not learn damp. A cat walks the aisle with the confidence of someone hired for a reason. A keeper lifts a lid, smells the air inside, and nods at the absence of surprise. Measures live here like elders. A rod sleeps on pegs at eye height, its ends capped with bronze, so time cannot shave it shorter. A capacity jar with a line cut cleanly around its neck sits on a shelf above the steward's table. When new jars arrive from the kill yard outside the wall, they are tested against that line. Water to the mark, poured into the newcomer if the lip blushes a little short. A layer of resin is taught to be a shoreline if it boasts too much. The jar is chosen for olives instead of oil. Fairness is a habit, not an announcement. Cord is language. Bundles are tied with loops that open before they argue, then sealed where talk should stop. A clerk warms a bit of wax with his breath, presses a ring with a mark, not a name to be read, only a shape that hands recognize, and lets the wax become thought. 4 jars bound to travel. A clay bullae is rolled between fingers and flattened with the same ring. When the cord is cut at the next room's table, the broken seal will speak in fragments that still mean yes. On the steward's board, smooth shards wait for ink. Names of things, not speeches. Oil to lamps by the gate, grain to the mill, salt to the fish yard, wicks to the bath, thread to the nets. A mark by each short. Good words for tomorrow to trust. Given, kept, sent, returned. A strip of fiber pinned under a small stone lists the jars turned this week, so last year's bottom will be this year's top. Rot learns patience when people rotate their trust. The kill yard beyond the wall smells of clean smoke and clay that has decided what it wants to be. Workers turn jars as they cool, so the shoulders learn roundness evenly. A potter scratches a faint ring where a hand prefers to hold. Another tests a lip with a pouring stick. A thin line of water agrees to be a thread and not a splash. In a shallow pan, resin warms on a slow fire until it forgets pride and becomes a seal that will be kind to both cork and clay. Along the wall inside, a rack keeps stoppers in families: figwood for oil, pine for grain, soak bark for vinegar, glazed plugs for brine. Each is wrapped in a twist of fibre, then set in a little sand bed to teach dryness. A boy labels trays with a scratch that only he and the steward need to understand the shape of a leaf, the memory of a knot. He sets one stopper beside a jar and does not push lids, prefer an invitation to a shove. At the door, the beam wakes to its fairness. Standard weights of grace of stone and bronze take their places like choir notes. A merchant brings sacks that will become measures. The steward reaches for a scoop that knows one capacity and no other. The scale loses its preference between left and right. A coin is weighed, not for greed, but for peace. The merchant laughs when the beam asks for one more pebble of bronze. He gives it as if returning a borrowed cup. Peace keeps stock better than fear. Tally sticks stand in a clay jar with their notches facing up, a quiet forest of promises kept. The steward breaks one with a twist, so to halves remember each other. One half goes with the courier, the other sleeps on a peg. When halves meet again in a week, a knot will be untied without speeches. The courier arrives with dust on his sandals and a satchel that remembers salt air. He drinks, sets his strip on the board, and watches as seals break with the soft sound of decisions held and honoured. He grins at the cat. The cat allows it. In a long room that smells of wood and bees, lids are dipped in warm wax along the seam where stopper meets jar. The wax is not a fortress, it is a polite doorman. A woman tests the cooling with a fingernail. When it takes a small print and releases it with dignity, the jar is ready to travel. She ties a loop that any neighbour could open in the dark. Loops secure more honestly than knots that boast. Storage breathes in order. Vents near the roof let heat drift away without learning to brag. A sweep walks the aisles with a reed broom and a cloth bag crumbs leave. Mice do not dare, the cat approves without offering to help. A jar that has wept a little at its seam is taught a better memory with resin and patience. When a stack of baskets sulks into lean, a wedge under the lowest ring of stone makes the world fair again. These are small sermons that never raise a voice. At noon a beam of light finds the steward's table and draws a pale line across a wax tablet. He sits in its warmth to check the day. Receipts married to their habs, seals broken and added to the small bowl where their waiter's evidence tally sticks matched. Some retiring to the jar of completed thoughts. He warms his pen in his fingers and writes a single sentence. Oil to lamps, enough grain to mill, enough salt to yard, enough wicks to bath, enough. He draws a lamp in the margin and, beside it, a small ring. Lamps and rings are distant cousins who keep households from becoming opinion. Outside, pigeons fold into the eaves and speak in numbers low enough to keep peace. The kill breathes one last time before resting. A cart rolls in with amphory from the coast, bellies diapered in straw, lips stopped with cork and a twist of bark. The ring at the gate learns the courteous tug of a loop and gives it back to the rope with pleasure. A keeper chalks a mark on the lintel deliveries received and brushes it off with a damp cloth after the entries are made. Marks do not need to live longer than their job. Farther down the lane, a small customs table sits in the shade. Not a trap, a rhythm. An officer lays the rod across a basket to teach the trader and the wall to agree on the idea of length. He lifts the lid of a jar and inhales the sea's memory in the olives. He seals the load with a lump of clay and the same ring used inside the warehouse. 2 rooms, 1 habit. He sets a pebble on the tally board under today's mark and goes back to his quiet. Toward evening, orders go the other way. Jars are chosen for the synagogue lamps, the bath, the quay. Stoppers rise with a sound that means tomorrow is provided for. A boy ties cords with the knot the old porter prefers and lays the loops facing the same way, so sleepy hands will thank him later. The steward places 2 lamps on his table, not because there will be speeches, but because rest is a standard too. He lights them from a wick trimmed earlier, and the room becomes polite. Tradition remembers great treasuries with secrets worth shouting about. Records suggest memory survives in rooms like these. Thick walls, fair rods and beams, jars that are taught what enough means, chords that open without insult, seals that break with the right sound, cats that work, pigeons that count, chalk that admits when its turn is over. People who sleep near such rooms wake with their shoulders an inch lower. The night archivist stands by the steward's table and writes on a strip. Rod Truemark kept jars, tested chords, gentle seals, honest weights, awake tally, married wax, polite lamps trimmed. He adds the lamp and the ring, folds the strip once, and slips it under the bronze-capped rod. The rod seems to approve of knowledge resting under it. If you want one picture to carry toward rest, a capacity line cut around a jar's neck, a rod on pegs, with bronze ends, a looped cord sealed with a quiet ring, a wax tablet crossed by a beam of noon stoppers, lined like well-behaved cousins, a cat at the end of an aisle deciding the day, has been sufficient to lamps at a table, where seals lie in a small bowl on punctuation. Rooms that remember this way are good neighbors to sleep. The 10th part. Time here prefers tools you can hold in one hand, on a roof at first light. A gnome on just a straight rod in a shallow bowl of santici, shadow to keep its manners. A boy smooths the sand with his palm and draws a fresh circle with a reed. When the shadow's tip touches the circle, he makes a small notch. The notch is not an argument with the sun, it's a handshake. Down in the lane, a shop opens when the notch says so, not when impatience does. In a courtyard that smells of lime and olives, an old clepsydra sits on a low bench, a clay vessel with a tiny, well-taught hole at its base and a line of quiet marks inside. Water leaves slowly, counting without drama. A woman fills it to the top mark and sets a pebble each time the thread of water kisses the next line. She isn't measuring people, she's measuring simmering lentils to softness. A dye warm, but never proud. A milk's rest under a stone. When visitors come later, they will taste minutes that were kept with kindness. At the city gate, a string with 7 knots hangs from a peg in the watchroom. No heraldry is attached to it. It is a week the size of a hand. Each evening, the keeper slides the lowest knot to the far side of the peg, where it will spend the night in the company of lamps. On the 6th shift, he trims to wicks at once and sets the pair together on the shelf where the ledger sleeps. The room seems to exhale. Rest is a standard, too. In the scribe's cool room, day keeps a second pace. On the wall is a board with simple signs, morning tasks on the left, afternoon on the right, both written in a hand that forgives. A little shelf below holds 3 pebbles and a strip of fibre with a lamp drawn in the corner. The pebbles move as letters dry, as receipts marry their habs, as lists are copied and posted for hands to find without thinking. Shadow slides along the wall like a polite ruler, and leaves the scribe exactly as much time as he deserves, never less, never more. By the lake, fishermen learn time by softness. Nets prefer dusk, when water becomes a sheet of patience. A man checks his board of pears pom, roof, rock, then roof, reef, light, and waits until the wind forgets to fuss. He strikes a tinder and cups a small flame in a clay bowl, sets it in the boat's nose, and lets the lamp teach edges to behave. Out on the water, other bowls appear, as modest as stars who decline to boast and shows work instead. On the ridge, a stone notch cut in a parapet receives 1 winter star with an accuracy that would make a mathematician smile, and then fall quiet. A watcher rests a string with 2 knots against the notch, and the star's arrival and knots. The season has learned its cue. Down in the press yard, someone hears of it and decides to set figs to drying a day earlier this year. Time is not a tyrant here, it's a neighbor who gives advice. Garden time has its own grammar. A girl in a shawl opens a clay gate with her thumb and counts to 20 with the slow pulse that bread knows. She closes the gate, waits for the water to finish a thought, then opens another. An old man ties a reed to a stick and lays it across a basin. When the water reaches the reed, he stops the trickle and smiles. Enough, he says, to no one in particular. The word belongs to gardens and ledgers equally. In the market, fairness has a schedule. The steward of measures arrives at the 2nd hour and wakes the beam. Stone and bronze take their places. The rod on pegs admits it has not shortened. He tests a coin as if listening to it wait, not sand, and returns it to its purse. At midday, He closes the chest and pours a finger of water from the clepsydra to the floor, a private ritual for dust. By late afternoon, the shade has migrated to the east side stalls. Cloth is covered, pickles are lidded, fish find salt again. Lamps eat a thread of oil and turn corners into friends. The bath keeper consults a bowl of warm and cool. He pours them in equal measure, dips the back of his hand, and announces nothing. The water announces itself. On the shelf above sit 3 jars, one of soap fruit slices, one of clean sand, one of oil scented like patience. He turns the jars so their cool sides will greet the next hand. He pulls a peg from the wall and listens for the small sound that says the drain has remembered its manners. Night prefers houses that do not argue with water. In a little tower over the gate, a bell with a low voice speaks only to weather and return. The keeper rubs it with cloth at dusk. He knows it could count hours, but he doesn't ask it to. The town already remembers when to open, when to weigh, when to boil, when to sweep, when to light to lamps. The bell is a companion to wind and boats. It refuses to be bossy. This is wisdom. Farther inland, a caravan station nods to its own calendar. A strip hangs near the cistern with 3 marks: dawn fill, noon check, dusk cover. A keeper draws a faint ring on the lip where strangers' cups should stop. He puts a fresh jar in a niche by the gate with a knot that opens easily, and a small line of chalk that says only, later. A trader, reading the same air, pushes his departure to the morning and unpacks figs and salt. He counts the day good, not because he travelled his longest, but because the schedule did not become a bullae. At the threshold of a small assembly room, someone tends to lamps with a habit we already know, trims wicks, settles oil, sets flame low so breath and word will be gentle. Inside, benches along the walls make a square of listening. A chest keeps words in a wrap that breathes. A reader holds a roll and speaks in a voice that never scolds. Children follow letters on shards with stylus tips, moving just slower than they would like. Time here is something you share, not something you own. On the inland road, a shadow line laid by the ridge crosses the path at different hours through the year. A walker who knows it can guess how far the next spring is. He carries a string with knots, 4 posts, 1 knot for each rest, and slides a knot to the other side of his belt when he reaches shade. The string is not a record to prove anything, it is a way to forgive the day its heat. He meets a milestone smooth with hands and sets his palm on it for the length of 1 breath. Stone likes being included. Tradition remembers calendars and decrees like loud clocks in proud halls. Records suggest this land like the small clocks. The shadow tip against a circle, a rope's knot at a peg, a 2-knot string greeting a star through a notch, a clepsydra that turned minutes into flavoured lentils, a bell that refused to be noisy, a week you could hold in 1 hand and light with 2 flames. Most people here slept because time behaved like a neighbour who knew when to speak and when to bring a loaf and a smile and leave before the tea went cold. The night archivist writes by lamp. Shadow taught water counted not skep, star received, garden timed weights, woken drain kind, bell polite, lamp spared. He draws the usual lamp and, beneath it, a little circle with a dot for the gnomon, a tiny clepsydra, and a string with 7 knots. He folds the strip once and tucks it under the sand bowl on the roof. The rod's shadow touches the new notch. The day nods to itself. If you want one picture to carry toward rest, a bowl of sand with a straight stick and a fresh notch, a clepsydra, giving away its minutes in a silver thread, a 7-knot cord resting on a peg, near to lamps, a gate bell polished too. A kindness, a roof notch, receiving a winter star, a garden's clay gate, opened by a thumb, a market chest, closing with the beam asleep, a fisherman's lamp in a clay bowl, low and modest, teaching the lake to be a room. Time can be held lightly. Sleep likes hands that do not clench. The 11th part. Wood keeps a quieter courage than stone. In a yard where plane trees lend their shade, beams lie on trestles like sleeping oars. A carpenter runs his palm along cedar and listens for a sentence the board wants to finish. He lifts a chalked cord, draws it taut, and lets it sing a straight line across the grain. The saw agrees to follow without being asked twice, Shavings curl like tame wind and fall into a basket that will later please a stove. Doorways are where a town decides to be careful. A threshold is set a thumb's height above the court, so rain will have to think twice. The pivot of a door sits in a cup of hard stone. The upper pin turns in a socket lined with oil and patience. A boy rubs the socket with a little fat and lime enough to make the wood forget its squeak. Not so much that dust will feel invited. The door swings, announces itself with a sound more like a greeting than a claim, and closes with a promise to do so again tomorrow. Roofs are flat where heat likes to lie down. Rafters span from wall to wall with a slight rise that only rain and carpenters notice. Over them run brush and reed, then clay and lime pressed by feet to find one mind. A woman taps the surface with a broom's back. Dull means safe, sharp means mend. A mason patches a small crack with clay from a jar and finishes with a wash of lime. White seals heat out and weather in. In one corner, a slightly higher rim makes a shallow pan. The spout train there knows the path to the cistern mouth and never forgets it. On the street side, a lintel teaches stone to carry its ambition kindly. Above it, a little arch of wedge stones, so shallow a passer-by may miss it takes the weight the lintel would have had to pretend not to notice. The mason taps each wedge until the arch finds its one voice, then he leaves, because fuss is the enemy of good work. A child reaches up and touches the underside of the lintel because the wood is smooth and cool. He will learn later that this smoothness is a kind of law. Inside, shelves float on pegs knocked into holes that the auger made with the same tenderness it would spare a wrist. A bench runs under a window where light likes to sit. Its top is slightly dished from years of bowls and elbows. The carpenter rubs the dish with oil and a rag until the wood forgives the day. A stool with 3 legs refuses to wobble because 3 is an honest number when floors have opinions. Ladders are moved more often than they are made. This one's sides are fig, its rungs olive, pegged, not nailed. A man sets it against a wall and looks at where the feet meet ground, then adjusts by the width of one reed. He climbs with baskets to the roof and lays them in sand to their shoulders. The baskets remember coolness and return it with kindness when hands find them in the afternoon. A looped rope at the stairhead pulley lowers a jar to the court without asking legs to argue with heat. It pauses above a child's reach and then completes its thought. In the covered lane, a wheelwright shapes a rim with patience learned from circles. He bends strips of soaked wood around a form and binds them with rope until they forget they were straight. Spokes meet a hub that was turned with a tool that sings only if coaxed. An iron tire waits on a small fire until it expands enough to forgive wood. The wheel is rolled over it and kissed with water. Steam rises, wood and iron become better friends, and the lane becomes a little wiser. At the edge of the carpenter's yard, tools rest in a rack with their mounts away from the path. A plane, its sole rubbed with a candle's fat chisels wrapped in cloth, so their first word is not a complaint and adds hung higher, because its swing teaches respect a square that would rather be right than famous a string with knots to set. Distances when rulers are not near. A boy returns a mallet to its hook handle first. Someone taught him the difference and never called it a lesson. Shutters at a window learn to be air. Slats tilt with a cord so the room will invite wind without allowing gossip. The cord is knotted where it meets the peg at the height a resting hand likes to find. A bee discovers the shade and leaves satisfied. A cat on the sill approves of slats that make bird watching a private sport. The slats are rubbed with oil twice a year. At the edge of heat and at the edge of cold wood prefers calendar over emergency. Past the lane, a small shed keeps earth and lime married. Barrels of slaked lime sit under lids, quiet as sleeping bread. A mason lifts a bit with a paddle and spreads it on a wall that has decided to remember the sky. He presses in a few chips of shell and river stone. The surface takes light differently where H rests. Later, whitewash will come with a wide brush, and the room will become a thought that windows will understand. At the base, a skirting of smoother plaster will help brooms teach dust to leave politely. In the metal corner of the yard, hinges with long leaves are laid out on a board. A smith punches holes with a tapered punch and listens for the metal's agreement. He rolls a barrel for a pin and slides a bronze rod through with a sound that feels like precision. He files edges until they lose their sharpness without losing their honesty. He wipes each hinge with oil and hangs it so it will not learn to bend where it shouldn't. Later, a door will thank this day with decades of quiet turns. A cooper has decided to try a small tub. Although jars still do most work, he lifts staves, checks their bevels, and pursues a circle that wants to be kind. Hoops wait like bracelets. He taps them down with a mallet that never shouts. Water poured into the new tub decides not to look for gaps. The cooper smiles, not at himself, but at the idea that wood and patience often say yes to each other when neither is hurried. When wind thinks about mischief, the houses think about straps. Timber laid into stone at corners acts like a belt. It does not show off, it simply encourages walls to remember they are a family. A carpenter checks a strap where plaster meets beam, taps a peg, and adds a wedge because the house is in trouble, but because trouble enjoys the path of least resistance. The wedge is the opposite. Evening draws grain out of wood and makes it visible. Doors close with sounds practiced for years. Ladders are taken in from the lane. A shutter cord is looped twice, not thrice, so morning will not be asked to argue with knots. The carpenter pours a little oil on a rag and walks the room hinge, latch, hinge wiping, listening, approving. He snuffs the lamp and trims the wick with a reed that lives only for that. The room smells of cedar, lime, and a workday forgiven. Tradition remembers palaces and courts. Records suggest most nights belong to beams with honest spans, lintels that admitted they needed help, thresholds willing to be a thumb high, doors that turned in stone cups with oil and patience, shutters that taught wine good manners, straps that reminded walls to stay married, tools that slept where hands expected them, ladders that refused to invent surprises. People sleep better in houses that know the difference between pride and readiness. The night archivist writes on his strip, "Being true lintel, help threshold kind door quiet, shutter obedient, strap set tools home, ladder honest, lamp trimmed." He draws a lamp and a little hinge, folds the strip once, and slides it under the plane on the rack. The plane seems to understand. If you want one picture to carry toward rest, chalk lines singing across cedar door pivot, sitting in a polished cup of stone lintel with a small relieving arch above it, like a whispered plan roof rim catching rain toward a spout that remembers ladder with pegged rungs leaning at the width of a reed from perfect while taking steam, and forgetting argument to hinges pin sliding with a sound like agreement, a shutter cord looped twice, a lamp snuffed and the wick trimmed with a reed that does nothing else. Wood and stone learn each other's good habits and choose to keep them. This is enough. The 12th part. Justice here prefers shade to spectacle. In the courtyard by the eastern gate, benches along 3 walls make a square of listening. A fig leans its leaves into the space, so words will land softer. The floor is swept to a pale silence. On a low table rests a lamp trimmed earlier, a small chest of weights, a rod with bronze-capped ends, and a jar with a round mouth, the color of honey kept for o's, not for show. The jar is empty, its work is to remind voices to be careful. People arrive in pairs, not crowds. A woman with a basket sets it on the ground so it will not argue with her lap, and waits without rehearsing. A mason with dust still in his hair touches the rod on the pegs, as if greeting a neighbor. The steward of measures is already here. He lays his hands palm down on the table, so impatience will have no place to stand. A scribe with ink on his fingers opens a roll and tests his pen on a shard. Begin, travel, stop. He writes the date not as numbers, but as a season. Everyone knows barley getting serious, olives still thinking. He writes names, the way a loom lays weft, plain, straight, strong. He draws a lamp in the margin, small as a punctuation mark. The lamp is not a symbol, it is a habit that helps. The first matter is simple and therefore worth doing well. A cord stretched between 2 pegs at a field's edge has been moved by the width of a sandal. The neighbors disagree about whose sandal that was. An elder carries in a string with knots, each the measure of a forearm and a thumb. He lays the string along the cane map scratched on the table's plaster. He does not accuse, he aligns. He brings out a reed, dips it, and marks the dots where last winter's stake holes were found under a stone holes measured this morning with calm hands. The stone had kept the memory better than either voice. The steward lifts the rod and lays it across the table. It does not lengthen for love nor shorten for fear. He sets a small weight on one end, as if to teach the rod to stay. Everyone smiles without showing teeth. The elder ties two knots in a short cord and hooks it over the rod's ends. The knots kiss the bronze caps. He nudges them until the cord is quiet. The woman nods. The mason nods. The scribe writes a single sentence. Cord restored to winter boundary reconciled with Peg's neighbors at peace. He puts one dot beside the lamp mark. Next, a jar has wept at a seam and ruined a day's cheese. The potter stands with his cap in his hands. The cheesemaker stands with a folded cloth. The elder asks the jar to speak by filling it to the capacity line cut around its neck. Water travels the seam, then stops where resin once tried and failed. The potter does not defend. He takes out a stopper that belongs to another mouth and admits to haste. He offers a new jar and an afternoon's help pressing curds. The cheesemaker accepts the help and the apology, which are the same size. The scribe writes, jar replaced, resin taught again, hands exchange work. He draws a small ring beside the lamp. Lamps and rings are cousins in this room. A weigher from the market brings a coin that disagreed with a beam. The steward places the coin on the plate and pairs it with bronze until the beam loses its preference. The coin is light by a sliver, too honest to ignore. No speeches, no curses. The coin is marked with a tiny nick and will be accepted at a discount that everyone knows without needing to call it by law. The striker who made such coins will be asked to watch the rod for an hour tomorrow. Watching rods makes better coins. The scribe writes, coin trimmed in honor market woken fair. He draws nothing, the beam has spoken. A dispute arrives wearing dust and whirring. To brothers share a donkey and a saddle, the strap broke, one says, the other tied the wrong knot. The other says the strap was old. A cobbler is sent for. He brings a last and a strip of leather. He ties two knots, one that persuades, and one that threatens, and sets the last on the bench for all to see. He pulls each knot until the wood complains, exactly as the saddle would. The first knot opens before it should. The second knot holds until it is asked to be kind. The brothers watch, then breathe. The elder writes on a shard, this knot, not that strap replaced in today's sheaf of straw to the cobbler for teaching. The brothers say together, enough. The scribe copies the shard onto the roll, then gives the shard to the brothers. Truth likes to fit in a pocket. Someone brings in a complaint about noise. A dye yard has been cooling vats late into the night. The keeper of the bath nods steam, wandered into sleeping rooms. The dyer admits the wind changed, and they did not think to open the yard's woven screens. The elder walks to the threshold and looks at the sky, which is already practicing evening. He suggests a schedule. Vats heated until the second hour past noon, screens set for the western wind stoppers oiled, so they will not argue at dusk. The scribe writes it as 3 lines, easy to remember, not because he is powerful, but because the town prefers remembering to punishing. The dyer bows and leaves a skein of colour for the bath shelf. It is hung on the peg with friendly debts. At midday, the courtyard breathes quieter air. A plate arrives from the kitchen, bread, olives, a shallow dish of oil with herbs, a cup of water that smells faintly of clay. Hands wash at the basin before they touch the bread. The elder lifts the lamp, trims the wick with a reed, and sets it back on the table. No one prays aloud, the gesture is the prayer. A child peeks through the gate and sees the lamp's oval on the plaster. He will remember the shape, which is the point. After the food, the chest of pledges is opened. Inside are modest things given as promises kept safe. A spindle whirl, a knife whose mouth has been covered, a folded strip of linen, a small bell for a sheep, a token from the baker's string. These are returned to their owners as debts are measured against work done. A woman receives her whirl and wipes it with her skirt, as if it had caught dust in a dream. A man takes his knife and oils the hinge. The scribe notes, pledges return promises equal. He draws a tiny spindle under the lamp. In the last hour of light, a stranger approaches with a cart. He bows at the gate, waits, and is invited to set his burden under the fig. The customs officer lays the rod across a basket, as if laying a hand on a shoulder. He inhales a jar of olives and hears the sea in them. He seals a cord with a quiet ring and slides a pebble under today's mark on the tally board. The elder offers water, not questions. The stranger drinks, wipes his mouth with the back of his hand, and says the coast road is kind today. Every face in the courtyard agrees with a small smile. Roads that behave are a kind of law too. Evening gathers and tilts the town toward lamps. The elder speaks the only sentence that has the right to end such a day. Let the gate be closed with a knot anyone can open in the morning. The keeper ties the cord high across the lane. It says room rather than wall. The scribe sands the roll's edge, ties it with a loop that remembers to be generous, and puts it in the chest that sleeps near the lamp. The lamp's circle touches wood, stone, and hands as if they were one material. Tradition remembers courts where loud judgments made walls proud. Records suggest most fairness was kept under fix. Rods that did not change, cords that returned to winter's place, beams that forgot their preferences, jars that learned to be honest, knots that forgave, schedules that faced the wind, pledges that came home, strangers who were given water before questions. People slept because their rooms and roads behaved like neighbors. The night archivist writes on a strip. Rod true cord restored, beam fair, jar replaced, not retort, screens set, pledges returned, guest watered, lamp trimmed. He draws a lamp and a small knot, folds the strip once, and slides it under the oath jar's lip, where it rests with dignity that asks for nothing. If you want one picture to carry toward rest, benches in shade under a fig, a rod laid across a plaster table, a short cord with two knots kissing bronze caps, a capacity line around a jar's neck, catching a ribbon of water, a cobbler's last showing to knots, how to behave, a skein of colour, hanging by a bath peg, a chest with modest pledges, return to good hands, a cord across a lane, making one room, a lamp, whose oval turns every edge gentle. Fairness can be made of tools and habits. That is enough. The 13th part. Harbours speak to languages water, and rope-hand both prefer low voices at night. Along the mole, rings polished by years wait without complaint. A watchman in a hood carries a small lantern with a wick that has been taught to mind itself. He checks each ring with a tug that contains both kindness and warning. Where one feels loose, he slips a thin wedge under its bolt and rubs tallow along the threads, so the ring will remember to be a friend to rope at dawn. The sea keeps a slow conversation with stone. At the outer light, a brazier sits on a platform reached by a ramp that even tired feet forgive. A keeper measures oil by habit, not by pride. 2 ladles for the first watch, 1 for the second, 1 held back for weather that changes its mind. He trims the wick with a reed that lives in a small jar, then shades the flame with a plate polished to a gentle shine. Out past the reef, a fishing boat becomes a certainty instead of a guess. On the quay, a ledger waits on a board whose legs are short and honest. The clerk warms his hands over a coal pan and softens a plug of wax with his breath. Packages arrive tied with loops that open before they argue. Jars in rope harnesses, bales in reed mats, baskets under cloth. He presses a ring into a clay bullae and hands it back to the captain, who tucks it under a knot any neighbour could untie. Seals talk in fragments that still say yes when broken in the right room. Fairies learn patience from the wind. The coxswain runs a palm along the gunwale to feel where the wood wants attention. He rubs oil into a tired knot in the grain, the way one might comfort a shoulder. A borrowed donkey with panniers stands quiet on the deck because the planks do not lie. The ferry noses across the inlet with 2 oars and a small sail that would rather help them perform. At mid-channel, a ballast shore gives 1 note in courtesy to the pair and the tide. Nets come home like wet handwriting. On the paving near a low wall, weights dangle in a neat line, while cork floats remember how to be light. A boy walks the net and whispers apology to knots that slipped while the sea was busy. He sets them right in the keeper's style turn. Tuck, kindness and tests with a tug. A woman salts the morning's fish in a shallow tray, layer on layer, then lays a reed mat and a flat stone on top, so the fish will learn to keep quiet while they become food for people far from the shore. A small customs table sits in the shade of a sail whose day is over. The officer keeps 3 tools: the familiar rod with bronze caps, a hook for lifting lids without picking fights, and a scrap of chalk. He lays the rod across a basket of dried figs and smiles at the way that refuses to grow or shrink. He inhales a jar of olives and hears a far cove in their brine. He marks the lintel with a quick line, then wipes it when the entry is made. The best marks live shorter than the truth they serve. Letters travel in reed cases, bound to a satchel that smells of sea and dust. Strips are tied with dyed threads, rust for the hill city, blue for the lakeside, green for the valley, so sleepy hands at the way station can sort by color when names escape them. A courier touches the ring at the key for luck and for discipline. He wears a string with knots for distances and small shells for posts. At the first station, he will slide a knot along the string and a bowl of water across the table. Both will agree about the hour. This makes roads more generous. Beyond the town, the road rises for a view. A milestone smooth with hands tells the walker that he has kept an old promise. Palm to stone, breath to chest, shoulder lighter than it was. A hut at the top keeps shade, and a jar sunk in sand to its shoulder. The keeper sets a cup on the low wall where strangers will find it without having to ask. He has scratched a faint ring where the cup should stop. When the wind turns, he lowers a woven screen and ties it with a knot that opens kindly even in the dark. Where rock allows, the road crosses water by stepping stones, set just proud of the flow. A man with a staff tests each, turns one a finger's breadth, and nods. He pushes his cap back and listens to the water explain itself. Downstream, a narrow bridge keeps its back to the sun and its feet in the river. The cutwater learns the simple sermon it must preach to driftwood: split and behave. A mason pats a seam with lime and sand until it goes from sharp to useful. He leaves while the river nods. At the far harbour, a pilot carries a board with pears palm, roof, rock roof, reef, light and a small lamp icon in the corner he drew years ago without deciding to. He lines shore marks as the boat glides. The inlet opens like a hand that remembers a promise. On the quay, a second ledger waits. Broken seals become quiet punctuation in a small bowl. The clerk weighs nothing without the beam's consent. The beam keeps no grudges when evening comes and the chest closes. Back inland, a post room under a con counts breath. A runner arrives dusty and satisfied, opens his satchel and sorts strips by dye. He drinks from the jar sunk in sand to its shoulder and sets the cup back on the ring he trusts. He twists a wick, trims it, lights the lamp, and reads quickly, not to gossip, to root. A woman copies a list for the hill road and pins it under a small stone. She adds one line in the margin in a hand that forgives. Road to the ridge, kind bridge, sound Ford set. She draws a lamp and a ring, because at this point, she cannot help herself. Tradition remembers great fleets and storms worth shouting about. Records suggest more nights at sea were low bowls of flame in boat noses, bells that refused to be bossy, rings that preferred to give rope back rather than argue, ledgers written as if numbers were people's neighbors, fairies that chose help over pride, posts that put cups where hands expect them, stones that turned just enough to teach water manners. People slept in towns that honored such instruments. Sailors slept in boats that trusted such shores. The night archivist rides at the quay on a strip, ring true lamp, steady seal, honest fairy, gentle net, and mended rod, fair cup, ready stone turned ledger kept. He draws a lamp and, beside it, a small boat bowl and a ring. He folds the strip and tucks it under the board's leg, so morning will feel seen when it begins again. If you want one picture to carry toward rest, a brazier at the mole, with a wick trimmed by a reed, a ring rubbed bright, where loops have learned courtesy, a clay bullae warmed by breath and pressed with a quiet mark, a fairy taking a gentle diagonal with a small sail, and to oars a customs rod laid across figs, a milestone smooth, with hands a hut with a jar shoulder deep in sand, and a faint ring, 4 cup stepping stones, turned a finger's breadth toward usefulness, a little lamp in a boat's nose, teaching the inlet to be a room. The sea sleeps because the shore keeps its promises. The 14th part. Night is the country's softest map. From the ridge to the quay, Small circles of light appear where hands expected them. At thresholds, on benches, beside jars, near cords tied high across lanes. Doors close with practiced sounds, shutters tilt to invite air and discourage gossip, hinges speak only impolite answers. The town does not go dark so much as it lowers its voice. At the gate, the cord that makes one room across the lane has learned its night, not the one that anyone can open in the morning without waking stubbornness. The keeper hangs the key to nothing on its peg. The key's main work is to remind pride that this is a house, not a fortress. He checks the lamp on the shelf and trims a single wick. To lamps would say ceremony, tonight asks for one. On the roof, a bowl of sand holds a small rod. The day's last notch is still damp where a boy marked it with a reed. He smooths the circle with his palm, not to erase the day, but to invite the next one to begin clean. Somewhere in the east, a star slides into the notch cut long ago in the parapet. The watcher notes it without calling it by name. Seasons prefer to be treated like neighbors who drop off figs and leave before the tea calls. Down in the water quarter, the Paul's reed gate is shut by a finger's width with the respect one shows a sleeping child. So fruit slices dry are a reed mat near a basin that will be kind in the morning. The bath's lamp finds its circle and teaches steam to be courteous. A jarring sand to its shoulder discovers that coolness can be a discipline as much as a comfort. The grate over the small full hums a note only sweepers hear. Where houses breathe in order the way trees breathe wind. The bronze-capped rod sleeps on its pegs, the capacity jar waits on its shelf, with a line around its neck that never moves. Stoppers in their trays remember which mouths they belong to without showing off. The small bowl of broken seals on the steward's table look like punctuation at the ending of a chapter. A cat patrols the aisle once, accepts the report, and curls on a mat that smells faintly of grain. In the kitchen courts, bread rests under cloth with the confidence of promises kept. Oil guards its quiet brightness inside lamps and shallow dishes. A basin and folded cloth near the door make water's courtesy visible even to the tired. Cheese under a smooth stone finishes the day's lesson in patience. A plate sits under another cloth the gatekeepers share. Someone will remember to carry it out before the lamps lift their eyebrows. On the river, the mill wheel slows to a hum one could confuse with breathing. The ford shows a dotted line of pale stones, like small moons, where feet will step tomorrow. The low bridge keeps the day's warmth in its back and returns the river's coolness to its feet. On the market street, the beam sleeps fair, the chest is shut, and the rod has decided to stop being interesting until morning. The lane's cord says room, not wall. In the crafts courts, a spindle basket sits like a quiet planet. A loom holds its figure without asking for applause. Dye vats exhale the last of their patience, and a bone needle sleeps point down in a small wooden apple. A last keeps the shape of a kind sandal. Cedar and bay leaves govern a cupboard with good manners. Mending waits for a day that deserves it. By the harbour, the outer light burns low on purpose. Its work is to be enough, not to be proud. The bell ashore gives one note the colour of warm metal and restraint. Fairies have folded their breath ropes, sleep in loops that open before they argue. Rings shine softly where courtesy has worn them into kindness. A courier ties his satchel's dyed threads in a knot he could open in the dark with cold fingers and looks toward the inland road. Not tonight. The road is allowed to be kind to itself. Under the fig by the eastern gate, benches are empty and cool. The jar with the round mouth, the one kept 4 rows, is empty in a way that comforts. The pledge chest has nothing in it because people collected what was theirs and returned what belonged to others. The rod's bronze caps reflect the lamp's oval and look almost amused. The scribe's roll sleeps under a loop that remembers to be generous. It will be woken by sand, not by voices. The night archivist walks the choir like a teacher admiring a row of small, correct letters. He visits the sand bowl on the roof, the reed gate at the pole, the rod on its pegs, the chest with its beam, the kitchen's basin, the lane's cord, the fairy's lamp, the hut's jar sunk in sand to its shoulder, the stepping stones with the fingers turned toward usefulness, the watchroom's 7-knot string besides a lamps, one of which is not lit, because enough is a standard too. At each, he writes a word on a strip, and does not say is allowed, taught, remembered, fair, kind, kept, shared, trimmed, ready, turned, paired. Back in his room, which smells like cedar and lime, and a workday forgiven, he lays the strips on a board and rests a small stone at each corner, so the night will not misplace them. He draws in the margin what he always draws and never explains: lamp, ring, line around a jar's neck, knot in a cord, circle in sand, star notch, reed gate, beam and weights. He folds the strips together once, then again, and tucks them into a small jar whose only job is to remind sound to be careful. He sets the jar where the lamp's circle reaches it without making a fuss. If you want one picture to carry into sleep, Elaine made one room by a cord a lamp's oval teaching corners, to behave a basin and folded cloth by the door a rod with bronze caps, not needing attention a capacity line around a jar's neck a sand bowl with a fresh notch smoothed by a palm, a star settling into a roof notch, a guest who knows where to sit, a reed gate over quiet water, a ring at the key, giving rope back without complaint to lamps on a shelf, one lit, one waiting, because fairness rests too. The country does not conquer the night, it welcomes it with habits. Elsewhere, histories are kept in loud rooms with walls that remember speeches. Here, the record drifts in low entries on shards and boards. Oil enough waits awake doors, quiet drains, civil knots, kind roads, ready lamps trimmed. People sleep not because the world forgot to be difficult, but because the tools they touch taught their days to be gentle. Stone learns, wood learns, water learns, hands learn. Night understands and stays.